Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Katz. I'm the Wendy Stark Curatorial Fellow at MOCA. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to our public program, which we've titled The Idea of Architecture. It's the third in a series of programs that we're holding in conjunction with our exhibition, Doug Aitken, Electric Earth. And the logic behind this series of programs is to conceive of the exhibition as a stage, as a broadcasting tower, as a platform to think or see or talk more deeply about some of the core concerns animating the artwork of Doug Aitken. And these we have identified as follows: the idea of language, the idea of time, the idea of architecture, the idea of the oceans, of narrative, and of sound. So tonight, Sharon Johnston, founder and principal of Johnston Markley, Michael Maltzan, design principal of Michael Maltzan Architecture, and François Perrin, an architect, curator, and educator, have kindly agreed to speak about how they approach the idea of architecture. And Doug will be joining them in conversation at the end of our program. So, by way of introduction, it may in fact be possible to, I think, trace the arc of Doug Aitken's career by following the line of architecture, to take as one point towards, say, the beginning of this arc, the earliest work in the exhibition, which dates to 1992. It's titled Inflection. It's a single-channel video, which Doug produced by launching a film camera attached to a small, high-powered rocket into the sky. It's a landscape, at times abstract, that then unfolds through a kind of contemporary technology of vision. The camera, turned downwards, registers the texture of the ground. First, a grainy surface that is in fact the asphalt where the launch took place. And then what comes into view is a parking lot, cars, buildings, a highway. This is a Southern California suburban landscape. The suburban grid, the built environment, is revealed in slow motion and becomes a kind of abstract pattern. So here, landscape and architecture are inextricable and made visible as a pattern of repetition and sameness, of sprawl, of the land ordered and ruled by, the land that's ordered and ruled is revealed, indeed as disorderly, is rendered as abstraction. This disorientation is at the center of Doug's own conceptualization of architecture as liquid architecture, in sculptures that extend space through mirrors surrounding the viewer, in performances that take place on barges floating through the sea or on trains that cut across the country east to west, to Doug's own house, his own private residence, which is an immersive, responsive environment that dissolves distinctions between inside and outside, between practical function and aesthetic experience. Most decisively, most impressively, and I think most indelibly in the history of art, in physical structures that are built from moving images. Doug's multi-channel, multi-screen, multi-sensory installations in which walls are erected by and then undone by projection is what I have in mind there. What I have in mind is that when we talk about Doug in classrooms, we talk about how he transformed film and video into a place that we enter, in which we are immersed, in which one's apprehension of time and place is governed or alternately disordered by the editing of sounds and images. When we talk about Doug Aitken at MOCA in this museum, we talk about how he has transformed film and video into an architecture that we share. How he has made moving images into spaces for museum visitors to gather, to be public to one another. So before I say thank you to all of you for gathering here tonight, I just want to mention one tedious business matter, which is that by the time our program concludes this evening, the museum will be closed, and I'm going to ask you all very kindly to exit through these doors here, to my left, your right. But we have much more in store before we get to that point tonight. We have presentations by Francois Perrin, by Sharon Johnston, by Michael Maltzan, and a conversation with all of them and Doug. So now I get to say it. Thank you all for gathering here tonight. Thank you to Sharon, Michael, Francois, and Doug. Please join me in welcoming first Francois Perrin. So they're just going to switch to your presentation right now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks, Doug, for inviting me to talk. I'm a little blinded by the light, but should I move somewhere else? Yeah, it's okay. I'll do it. Yeah, I'm really happy that to talk tonight for this show because I mean it's the first time I see the show tonight. I was traveling, but I'm really amazed. I mean, I know the work of Doug pretty well because we've known each other for quite a long time, and I've seen his work in different venues. But it's nice to see everything's together, and to me, he's one of the artists that's really challenged what an exhibition is about. And I think today, I mean, India art is what really interests me. Before knowing Doug, I was moving to LA 16 years ago. I was living in France, and I was close to artists that actually were friends with Doug, like people like Philippe Parreno or Pierre Huyghe, and people that were using the exhibition as a medium of expression and challenging this medium. And actually, it's these people who connected me to Doug. When they knew I was moving to LA, they say, like, you really need to meet this guy. He's kind of like you. I mean, we have things in common we won't talk about. We'll keep them secret tonight. But anyway, I'm really happy to be able to talk about my work and my kind of approach of architecture. So I brought a few images. I'm going to start with this image of another artist, famous French artist called Yves Klein, here jumping into the void, inhabiting the space, because that's another artist that was really interested in the idea of architecture. For him, architecture was kind of another level of his exploration of art. He started with painting. He's really famous for his monochrome painting. Sculpture was the next step for him, and architecture was the third step. After he envisioned becoming a politician, but he died before. But here you see him like jumping in the void. It's a famous image of him. And Yves Klein was so interested in architecture that he kind of wrote like many books or stories about it and collaborated with architects on drawings about his ideas. If you know a little bit of the work of Yves Klein, it's really about the invisible. And to quote Saint-Exupéry, what's invisible is essential. And he really kind of developed a body of work about that idea of what you can't see, what you can't touch, something very more conceptual. And he applied that to architecture. For him, architecture was more like the invisible, what's in between the walls, what you cannot really see, but what you feel, what you inhabit with your body. And maybe we can, I need to go to the second picture. That's image of one of Yves Klein's last exhibition, where actually he tested some of his idea about architecture. To sum up his work, which was called The Architecture of Air, it's like recreating like artificial climate that allows people to live outside in the open space without walls, without ceilings, and just using natural or artificial elements like fire, air, or water to recreate like the perfect climate and create like a new type of architecture. Another thing that Yves Klein was saying, and that brings us back a little bit to the show, and I'm really glad that this retrospective of Doug was called Electric Earth, because I would say that's one of my favorite pieces of him, and maybe the piece that came up when we first meet or first starting together. And I don't know if you've seen the piece in the exhibition. It's about this fellow that go through a city, obviously Los Angeles, and connecting with the invisible aspect of the city, the radio wave, the sounds, the neon light. And this creates an architecture, and Yves Klein was really saying the same at the time. He was saying that light, sounds, or materials, and you can create like an architecture from these immaterial things, which are not like common material that we used to build architecture, but it's really the architecture of the future will be made with this kind of invisible or immaterial. And I really think that Doug's is continuing that idea. I'm just going to finish on his work with like a drawing that was made by Claude Parent that illustrates a little bit this utopian city of people living in the outdoor, levitating on air, being close to walls of fire to heat them up. So they don't need to have clothes. They're naked, and they don't even need to work because the future of society is not about working. And they're protected by this giant roof of air. So that was the kind of major foundation for my approach on architecture. And I was lucky when I moved to LA to actually curate an exhibition on this work that took place at the Schindler House. So here is a view of the installation. I don't know if some of you have been to this house. It's one of the most interesting houses. Maybe some people called it the first modern house. It was done by this young Austrian immigrant who came from Europe and wanted to explore like a different way of creating architecture. And a lot of this house actually takes place outside, like the living room, our door, like the bedroom are on the roof. But to create a show in that space was kind of challenging because that place also can be very warm. So my design for this exhibition was to change the climate of the house, and following in the footsteps of Yves Klein's idea of changing the climates at the surface of the earth, I tried to with like this special fabric to cool down the house and allows the work to be protected. Here you see like a vision of one of the patio that was covered with this screen protecting from the sun, but also misting some water, like cooling down. So we had some kind of weather station that was recording the condition of the climate and acting on it. So this is a view from inside the house. Would it be possible to have some water, or like a cup of water maybe? And in the house we had to place the work on the ground. So it was like way cooler than, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. So we work with like climate people who look at the house and did like a study of all the kind of different warm space of the house that allows us to react to it. This is I'm going to show you two other projects where I use the same type of material and try to recreate like a different climate. And this was for like a gallery called Materials and Application in Silver Lake that invites architect and designer to produce some experimental type of work. And I didn't want it to create something really formal, really sculptural, like a lot of projects taking place there. And I wanted more to create like an atmosphere, an environment that will allow people to express themselves. So I built a stage and then used the same material to protect the space from the sun and have that almost like a public space in the middle of the city and creating like this little microclimate in the middle of Los Angeles. So you see this light fabric made of, oh, thanks a lot. I'm gonna take a little break. So I use this material in a few projects and installation to create like this type of microclimate in the city and regarding the location. So this one was in LA. Another one that was done was in Miami Beach. This was done for the Maltzan School of Art, which is a free school of art that was created in LA by Piero Golia and Eric Wesley 10 years ago. And they wanted to present the school in Miami during the art fair, and they asked me to design a hotel for them for like maybe $300 on the beach. So the idea, the challenge was to be able to create something that would protect the students and the people attending the school from the sun, from the heavy sun, but also resisting to the wind, to the to the kind of climatic condition that you can find. Here's a view of the project during the day. So I call this serial project the geometry of climate. Was really the idea of creating objects that were responding to the specific climate of their location, and using new material to respond to these specific conditions. And then I started building projects that were not temporary, that were more like permanent. This one, I mean, it continues that same reflection on climate and context, and how do you respond to the context. Oh, an architecture can have like a dialogue with its environment, not just trying to protect itself, but also having a dialogue with the sun, with the wind, with the rain, and accepting these elements, and thus creating space that are alive, and where you feel alive, when you feel more in connection with the place you are. So that was the extension of a classic bungalow in Venice, and the project was to create like a transition room in between the house and the garden, and something that was really open to the air and the circulation of air, and would allow to naturally climatize the house. This is a view from inside the house. It was also kind of a response also to the construction technique that takes place in California or in Los Angeles, and which is a really poetic way of building with all these wood frame, but most of the time that you don't see when the house is finished. And I wanted to keep that as a space in process in construction. Here you see a little diagram that explains this concept of the geometry of climate. You have on the right or the left the existing house, and then in the middle that would be the ideal volume created in regard to the location and the orientation of the lot. And then the project is the encounter of the two spaces. In the same series, like another little project that took place in Brentwood, it was a little guest house for a Buddhist scholar, and the idea was to also create something that would act without air conditioning, and so I created like a wall of air in between the interior walls of the house and the exterior walls, and that kind of wall of air allows for like a kind of natural protection of the house, and there's also like airflow going through the house. But the house is kind of naked. Also, you show all the structure that most of the time is covered during or at the end of construction. So the house is more existing as a process and showing its bone and showing its structure. And and that's another house that I designed in the Hollywood Hills, and this one is from kind of a different scale and using different material, even more permanent than the two precedent projects. But also this project, like the goal was to create something that would almost disappear in the landscape or make one with its environment. So more than half of the house is buried underground, and then thus allow the house to operate without any air conditioning. So none of the projects I've done use air conditioning, and I think even if the weather can be challenging in LA, I think it's one of the places in the world where you really can recreate this outdoor architecture, what I was talking at the beginning with Yves Klein's idea of air architecture. These are other view of the house that kind of is totally buried in the ground and just open itself in certain views. And then I'm going to be short. I'm going to finish with the project I'm going to present next year in New York. This is a drawing that was done 50 years ago by François Perrin, a French designer that wanted to illustrate an article by Rainer Banham in the magazine Art in America, 1966. And the article was called "A Home is Not a House." And that was Rainer Banham is this famous architectural critic that wrote that famous book on Los Angeles and the four ecologies, and wrote a lot of books on the idea of architecture and sustainability and energy and the use of energy. And he came with this idea. I mean, one of his concepts is that the fire was maybe the first architectural environment where people would gather around the fire, and the heat of the fire and would create some type of architecture. And so he wrote an article saying that with the new technologies, maybe we can reduce a house to just like a pod, a technological pod, and then we can create like a much more freer environment around it, thus creating this invisible bubble, this immaterial plastic bubble. So I created an exhibition in Los Angeles in the spring on this designer, and I wanted to take the show to New York, and then the show is becoming something else. So we're gonna build the bubble. This is not the final design, but this is the location. It's gonna be part of Performa, that Biennale of Performance, next year in New York in the fall. And we're going to place the bubble in the middle of Manhattan in Madison Square Park. And you're all invited to come. So here's the end of my little presentation, but I'll be happy to talk more with Doug about these ideas, and then I'm going to give the mic to Sharon.
Maybe I'm going to try this seat. Maybe this is a little better. Thanks. Really, it's a beautiful presentation. Francois, thank you. I can't see anything past Doug's face. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you to Doug, and I know Philippe isn't here tonight, but to you both and to your teams and to Anna. I think it's really, I think you guys have made an incredibly sort of generous forum for us to come and exchange our ideas in the context of your show. So I appreciate that a lot. And it's a sort of inspiring and open forum. And I was reflecting, just thinking about what I might present to you all tonight to engage in our conversation. I was thinking a little bit about some of the things that you and Philippe talked about. Maybe you don't remember, but in your conversation after the show opened. And a couple of things struck me that were somehow, I think, resonated with the way that we have formed our practice. And I think they were two, and in a way kind of converse. The first was about, I think on the one hand, there's an incredibly obsessive focus on kind of inward examination of the structure of film and breaking it down into the most kind of irreducible components of narrative and sound and questions of breaking linearity and all the things that we see in these works. So, and then on the other hand, I think a real interest, Philippe was talking about this a lot, this idea of sort of expanding beyond the space of the museum, the idea of kind of permanent transmission, broadcasting, really enveloping a very large space, much further than your own, the space of production of the work. And I think that resonated a lot for me, and so I wanted to talk about those ideas within the context of our practice. So just a few words of introduction. I practice together with my partner Mark Lee, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but we have our studio based here in LA. We also, as much as we're focused on practice, we're also teaching and devote a lot of our time and sort of the way we structure our office. And our teaching work has a lot of kind of synergy between those two kind of modes of work. And I think that we are just maybe saying a few words to give some framework to the work that I will present, which is essentially one project and a couple of different types of modes of output, let's say, that are in support of the building work that we do. And I think on the one hand, there's I think we think a lot about boundaries in our practice. We're kind of obsessed with kind of core issues in architecture, really looking at the sort of irreducible conditions that architects need to think about, which of course includes issues about climate and kind of ecologies, but paradigms of typology, of structure, of form, of sort of atmosphere are things that we really obsess about. And I think on the other hand, we're also very, very interested in issues of context in our work, and that means maybe the obvious things about site and situation of making a building, but I think it also expands beyond that for us, and it's a much more, it engages history, it engages maybe parallel practices to do with art historical, questions of art history, contemporary art, and other cultural practices. And so I think in that way, and this kind of radical look inward and attention to the boundaries of our discipline while we're immersing ourselves in a much more expanded set of ideas has led us to what I would describe as sort of expanded field of collaborators, and a lot of those are around the disciplines of contemporary art and culture. And I think for us that means not necessarily we're not a practice, I think, that would be defined by interdisciplinarity or blurring of boundaries, but really about a way of exchanging ideas that are always brought back and filtered through the lens of us as architects. So the first couple of projects I'll just show an image of are projects where we've worked really specifically with artists on our teams. And this is a competition entry for, it was a combination of a natural history museum and a state archive in Basel. And the minute we read this brief, we knew that we wanted Sam Durant on our team. I think Sam was somebody that could help us synthesize ideas of images and archiving in a way that maybe nobody else could. And so we worked with Sam originally just kind of conceptually, and then he worked with us to develop this terracotta facade system that you see in this image. We've also had, this is a project that we did maybe 5-6 years ago with Wally Beshti. It was an exhibition at the Italian Cultural Institute. And this was, we were asked to produce this exhibition together, and so it was not only a space to exhibit our work, but we took it on as a kind of total environment together, and that included designing these kind of reinterpreting what it might mean to design a base for a piece of sculpture, and that came about by our sort of shared interest in systems of modularity and serial structures, and kind of co-opting this kind of historic idea of the sculptural base. At the Peabody Essex Museum, a sort of historical museum in Massachusetts, we collaborated with the Swiss artist Marianne Mueller on this armature that was part of an exhibition. She was working with the archives of the museum, and we developed, based on a kind of geometric studies of Max Bill, this new mast, kind of sculptural element that would support her work. We were part of an exhibition several years ago, or it was a project that became an exhibition with Ai Weiwei at the Ordos 100, where Weiwei as an artist really became our client and was a sort of mad scientist project of 100 houses in the middle of nowhere in China. And then finally, this project, it's for an art foundation that's based in Los Angeles and Rome called Depart Foundation. This is a winery, a space for the production of wine, but also art exhibition. So we're designing this building, and not long after we began it, our client commissioned Daniel Buren to create a sculpture for the courtyard of the building. So we're very slowly developing that work, and sort of a reciprocity of engagement with Danielle and Pier Paolo and Valeria. I think another kind of mode of output that is runs through our practice is this kind of image making, which involves these collages. And I'll just say a few words about this one, which was for a very early house that we did that called the Hill House. And it was an image we made when we submitted the project for a competition before the house was built. And we, of course, you guys all probably know this image of Julia Schulman, but when the project was finished, the image was published, some of our friends who are lawyers got really concerned and said, you better meet Julius. He might sue you guys for making this image. And so we met him, and took him to lunch. He was a really wonderful guy, and decided that he wanted to come photograph the house when it was done. And I think that was really the beginning of even a more deeper engagement with artists, largely through photography, but also through collaboration and exhibition design. And so this kind of mode of collage has been a method for us. We make these images at different points in our design process that helps us kind of create this context that I was talking about for the work, often testing our ideas against significant works of architecture or spaces that are in other kind of cultural realms like film, where gives us a chance to really distill an idea in the work to sort of something that's irreducible, and somehow this production of these images with the reduction of line and sort of really clear visuality allows us to kind of challenge perhaps some of the other, or strip away some of those other kind of technical things that we as architects have to deal with. And last year, in 2015, this work, both the collages and some work from a book that I'll show you a couple of images of, was part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And for this kind of, we're not curators, but we really are very engaged with the contemporary, kind of expanded contemporary practices both in LA and around the world. And Mark and I have just been named as the artistic directors for the next biennial in Chicago in 2017. So we hope you guys will all come, but I think this is maybe yet another dimension of kind of how we think about our work in this expanded realm. And then related to that work was a book that we just published. And this, most architects at year 10 or 12 start getting offers to do a kind of, some sort of a monograph. And for us, we felt that was way too early in our careers. And somehow monographs always seem like more of a kind of encapsulating, culminating kind of effort. And so we took a different tack, which was together with our designer and editor, Reto Geiser, we invited a number of collaborators, a group of artists and curators, historians, to engage in a conversation with us through the production of images and conversations. And so this is Marianne Mueller again. She created what we call an extended cover, which situates our work within the sort of larger cultural context of Los Angeles as she knows us and the city of LA. And then Livia Corona produced this portfolio of the Sale House. It's called House for Sale, where she worked with senior citizen actors to create a kind of new way of dwelling in this empty house. In Argentina, the View House, this was a collaboration with the filmmaker Nicolas Valentini, where the house is very much based on a kind of cinematic procession. And so Nicolas made a film of the house, and these are film stills from that movie. Louisa Lambry photographed the Hill House, and here she's kind of zooming in on almost 1 square inch of the building, but kind of turning the very kind of massive sculptural building into a really kind of delicate palette of light and shadow. Veronika Kellendorfer, a Berlin-based artist who did a sort of diptych portrait of the Hill House together with a series of a kind of portrait of Catalina. She was kind of fascinated with this kind of island seaside landscapes and brought those two together in this portfolio. And Walid was sort of fascinated by the sort of anthropomorphic qualities of our buildings and worked in this software, comic book software, to create this sort of very, very internal conversation amongst all of our buildings. And then Jim Welling, looking at Porch House, really sort of our obsession with apertures. So Jim focused on colleagues kind of light and aperture. And then Jack Pearson with the Vault House. And then Marianne closing the book. And then I just wanted to end with one project that I think is, I think through this kind of practice that we've shaped for ourselves, it has meant we've worked in a lot of kind of art and cultural projects. And this is the Manil Drawing Institute. It's a building it'll finish construction and open about this time next year. So, you know, this is Renzo Piano's The Manil Collection from the late 80s. This is the Twombly Pavilion from the late 90s. And so this is the Drawing Institute. And of course, it's a significant campus. Probably most of you have been there. And I think what was fascinating for us as a building project was that this is a small building. It's 30,000 square feet. So it's somewhere between the scale and sort of atmosphere of the museum, and this is the Philip Johnson house that the Manils commissioned in the 50s. And so this idea of being between a domestic and an institutional building was really fascinating to us. And further, I think, to the idea of the courtyard for both the house and Renzo's building, this sort of kind of impossible indoor-outdoor sort of tropical atmosphere of Houston was key to our thinking about organizing the Drawing Institute. And even looking more deeply into the space of the Manil house, this idea of the Wonder Cabinet, this is Dominique's liquor cabinet, which is really a fascinating space. But for us, this sort of radical interiority was on the one hand juxtaposed with the kind of severity of the landscape. And finally, this sort of inner sanctum-like quality of a Shaker meeting room or Johnson's house, where we're part of a really wide range of precedents that we looked at. And for those of you that have been here, it's a really surreal place that's made up not only by the institutional buildings, but these bungalows that they're all unified simply by this coat of gray paint. And then finally, the kind of surreal and beauty of these 100-year-old oak trees that define the light and atmosphere of this campus. So for us, the Drawing Institute, it's a museum for drawings, relatively unprecedented museum type. The idea was simply to first start by drawing just a thin line of the roof over and extending into the landscape to create a kind of halo of light and shadow around this building. So from the south, in a new park that will be on the campus, it feels quite sort of like a kind of hermetic building, just simply a porch in the landscape. And as you come closer to the building, it's sort of transparency in the first room of the building, which is a garden, a sort of hortus conclusus, which is a courtyard that you enter through before you arrive at the building. And then as you move all the way around to the west, it almost looks like two small houses nested next to each other with a transparent space, which is what we call the living room. It's the entry to the building. And then here is one of three courtyards. All of the spaces, all the entries to the museum are through a garden, which is both technically important because of the way that the garden modulates light, reduces temperature, and sort of makes a threshold out in the garden before you enter. And then on the east courtyard, a similarly sized but kind of different agriculture and sort of atmosphere with flowers and smaller scale trees. And then all of those spaces connect in this space we call the living room, which is both an entry, a meeting space, a space for lectures and different kinds of productions that doesn't have the climate and lighting demands that the gallery does. The exhibition gallery, which is tuned precisely in terms of scale and atmosphere for drawings. And then the third courtyard, it's the scholar courtyard as we call it. It's a much different, more intimately scaled landscape, very different quality of light and shadow. It's a space to work in, to circulate through, and to just almost like a cloister in a religious space. It has that sort of ambiguity, but kind of solemnity. And then the heart of the building is the drawing room. It's a space where the one space where drawings can come in contact with light. So still very sort of low tech, but working with different scrims and layers of light and filters to create a space to study drawings in the heart of the museum. And then as a kind of companion to that is the scholar conservation space, which this is the library, and just to the north of that is the conservation library and lab. So this kind of pairing of these spaces of gardens, outwardly oriented spaces and inwardly oriented spaces is really what defines the building. And this final image, I think, is a kind of twilight image looking back from the west, looking into the building. But I think in a way this image sort of encapsulates a lot of the principles of architecture that we're interested in, which is this sort of twilight condition of not, between inside and outside, light and dark, building and landscape, that they hold together, but they're sort of contradictory yet complementary. And I think that is something that probably courses through all of our work. So that's it. Thank you.
I'm Michael Maltzan. When Doug invited us all to speak today or tonight, it was under the idea, or along with the idea that the title of this particular evening, the idea of architecture, and that's a very large, expansive idea, I think, for any architect. What it does say, however, is, or at least it starts to promote the idea that architecture does, in fact, have an idea, that ideas are a part of architecture, which is a significant thought leap. And in our work, much of the way that I've thought about architecture has been, to a large extent, not so much about the idea of architecture, that's implicit, I think, in the work, but just as much so about the idea of the city and architecture's role or relationship to the city. Living in a place like Los Angeles, practicing in a place like Los Angeles, constantly calls into question that idea of what city is and what architecture's relationship is to it. It's one of the fascinating things about Los Angeles as a place to work in and from, because ideas about urbanism, about city, about form, about space, about architecture are constantly in a process of flux, I think. Change is written into the kind of idea of this place. But it also makes for an extraordinary laboratory where I think true invention can take place, where more traditional types of buildings, like houses, institutions, are able to transform in some way, to invent new forms and new typologies. But also to very much invent new ways in which we continue to live in the city, both as individuals and collectively. I like this image. Iwan Ban, a photographer who we work with quite a bit, took this image for a book that we did a few years ago called No More Play. In a sense, this captures the two scales of quintessential, iconic Los Angeles, the endless carpet of single-family houses and the infrastructure, the large-scale infrastructure of the highway. In a way, implicit in this photograph is the space of both the individual and the space of the collective. But I think you could say either of those two forms could be the space of the individual or the space of the collective, depending to a large extent on your own psychological connection to where you are in the city. I want to talk about a range of projects, but I want to start with a house. And I want to start with this quote, Alberti, who important theorist in architecture, talks about the relationship of the house and the city, that implicitly both of those ideas, both of those forms are written into each other. And I think that that's true. And to a large extent, through the study of the house, it is possible, I would argue, that you are really studying the city, that the house itself is a kind of microcosm of many of the same mechanisms, ideas, ambitions, hopes, dreams that exist in the city. A number of years ago, we built a house for the artists Larry Pittman and Roy Dowell on the edge of the San Gabriel Mountains, really the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, right at the threshold between the wild of the San Gabriel Mountains and the Angeles Forest and that kind of endless sprawl of the San Gabriel Valley. The house is immediately adjacent to a Neutra house built in the 50s for Mr. and Mrs. Cyrulnik. Mrs. Cyrulnik was Richard Neutra's assistant for many years. It's a quintessential Neutra house, quite small, about 1,300 square feet or so, and almost completely transparent in glass around the exterior. The thing about this house is that while it is modern, it's not necessarily, I would say, contemporary. It doesn't necessarily relate to many of the same challenges that we face in terms of the way that we live. That constantly evolves, and houses constantly evolve with those different ideas. But that idea of incredible transparency, and the idea that you are constantly connected to the outside, as if the inside, your inside life and the outside life are one and the same, while fantastic, very beautiful in early modernism, is not necessarily something that relates to our very contemporary reality, which is that because of many things, but especially because of technology, you can make the argument that we are constantly connected, completely transparent on a 24-hour basis. And in conversations with Larry and Roy, one of the goals that came out of, one of the ambitions that came out of those conversations was that was to explore the idea of a contemporary house as the alter ego to the Neutra house, and to make a much more internal house where transparency happened on the inside and it was much more opaque to the outside world. It's a 7-sided house with an internal courtyard and an interior that has, with the exception of the front door, really no doors in it intentionally, and where spaces like bedrooms, bathrooms, the central courtyard, the living room, all in a sense blur together, that each of those spaces is completely accessible physically but also visually to each other, as if you're living in a completely simultaneous world. And that idea of simultaneity is something that increasingly is a fascination in my work, and I would say is, to my thinking, one of the truly significant spatial problems that architects have to confront. Is really our spatial problem at this point in history. The idea that we are in all spaces conceptually at the same time, and how do you begin to make an architecture that has that as a quality from that idea? Moving from the house to a more collective housing project where multifamily housing where many individuals live together. We finished a project called Carver Apartments about 6 or 7 years ago, immediately adjacent to the 10 freeway. In fact, really adjacent to the 10 freeway. It's about 20, 25 feet away to the highway, which is elevated. And I was interested in whether some of these ideas that we had begun to look at, even in Larry and Roy's house, were transferable to this project, where it's not so much about the same radical simultaneity through transparency, but certainly through proximity and adjacency. There is a very strong relationship between an internal community and this larger Main Street in Los Angeles. There are a lot of issues technically that had to be dealt with. One of them was acoustics, and that had something to do with this round form, because it put as little surface area next to the noise as possible. But that form, that round form, also had the effect of, for people passing by the highway, starting to create a kind of visual choreographed relationship, almost as if the building was spinning if you were moving quickly by the building. This is permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless individuals. Ironically, the building is built literally at the end of Hope Street. It is on the ground level more connected to the underneath of the highway than to the top of the highway. And that space and the idea that infrastructure, which often, as I've argued, is a kind of monoculture, only does one thing, could become something else, was very much on my mind. While we couldn't literally attach the building, although I had a fantasy of it, attach a building to the highway, the ground floor, which you see in the plan on the left, starts to have a series of visual or perspectival skewers that connect the alleys, the street, the cul-de-sac, and the space underneath. So as you're moving around the building and you're underneath the highway, that becomes not so much forgotten space, but very much an extension, at least implicitly, of the space inside the building. And I'm showing these two images. The other plan is Pittman Dowell, to show that there was a kind of connection between the way in which space layered, different programs layered adjacently to each other, the way visually perspective starts to work within the building, and you can maybe get a sense of the way experience starts to grow out of those interfolding plan geometries. As you move up through the building, the form takes that round form that you see from the outside. It's a much tighter courtyard on the inside that is very much the collective or community space, open to the top, which forms an oculus to the sky. This isn't real, but it is a kind of, well, I don't know if it's an ambition, but it is an idea that maybe infrastructure could be thought of as more of a sponsoring armature for development. As the highway and cars continue to change in a city like Los Angeles, architecture and its relationship to things like the highway might likely change. It would be extraordinary to think of the highway not so much as something that you want to get away from, but a place that you want to live next to because of the possible qualities of connection that it provides. Maybe one of the other most significant challenges for Los Angeles is density. And that has a real effect on all of our lives, especially if you're trying to get here tonight in time to see this talk. But it's a new phenomena in Los Angeles. And for a long time, the way that Los Angeles and the psychology of building in Los Angeles, literally the way that I think we have constructed our identity in this city, has been about continuing to push the boundaries out further and further and further. That limit, for lots of reasons, has likely been hit. And as that limit has been hit, the city is starting to look more inward to itself, to build and to deal with the kind of density and occupation that's part of our reality and future of the city. I was interested in this project, Star Apartments, to begin to investigate, one, density. How dense could you actually make a building in Los Angeles that wasn't used to it? But also, was there a kind of hybrid form or a new typology that could be created by developing such a significant density in the city? This is 106 units that exist on the corner of 6th and Maple, not too far from here. There was an existing building on the site, a kind of stucco box that had a concrete frame. It was mostly sewing shops that we were able to keep. But one of the challenges in keeping that was that it meant there was almost no site to actually build the project on. And out of that, we began to look at whether you could build the majority of the building by using prefabrication. All of the units here are prefabricated in Boise or outside of Boise, Idaho, trucked to the site and then lifted into place. What was amazing was that it took about 4 weeks to put all of the units in place above this existing building. So from a technological standpoint, very interesting in terms of the development of maybe new ways of building housing in the city. But just as much so, the the combination of the existing building on the ground floor, which we did reclad, and the apartments on the hovering above created this layer of space at the second floor, which is for the most part at the roof level of all of these adjacent, very horizontally scaled buildings in downtown Los Angeles. I began to think that that was a kind of equivalent to maybe that space under the highway, that infrastructural space that could become the community space for not only this community, but some of the other buildings that this building as permanent supportive housing serves as well. That's still starting to develop. Things like the community gardens have started to really flourish. The space on your right, that big tall space, which is a half-court basketball court, is now starting to develop. There's a running track, there's classrooms up there. And it allowed us to create a kind of social space in that horizontal grain of the city that is very unusual for that type of multifamily project. Around the same time, we finished a project also not very far from here called One Santa Fe on the edge of the Arts District right next to SciArc, and also immediately adjacent to a series of rail lines that include the MTA, some freight lines, and the Los Angeles River. This entire district is marked by long, linear, either infrastructure or historical remnants, and our building is a very long, linear, more or less low-scaled building, taking advantage of pieces of site that very few people knew existed, kind of rights of way and abandoned rail lines in this part of Santa Fe Avenue. If you stood it on end, I've always wanted to do a tower. I've never gotten to do a tower, but on the one hand, project is about its scale, but it's also about the fact that one of the criticisms that's been levied at this building, which I've heard, is that the building is big, that it's out of scale for its context. And this is one of the other fundamental ideas about architecture that relates, I think, to also the idea about city, and very important for a place like Los Angeles. It is true that in many ways this building could be seen as being out of scale for the context as it exists today. But in a city that's changing as rapidly as Los Angeles, and given how long architecture very often takes to finally build, the idea of what context is today is a fungible thing. It changes constantly. I believe architecture also has a significant responsibility to propose a scale, a kind of anticipatory scale that might forecast what the city is going to be like in 10 or 20 or 25 years, to try to match the scale of the city in the future so that the building is not outmoded on day one. Some of that anticipation is just an image of it as it floats above the grain of the city with Boyle Heights behind. Some of that anticipation is in the scale of the building, but also in terms of the types of spaces that get written into the building. This is, you can see the long bridge. There's a portal that connects from SciArc, Santa Fe, all the way through a mid-courtyard back to the train tracks. And right now it looks like it dead ends back at the train tracks. But in fact, one of the goals is that eventually there are a series of tethers and bridges from those apertures in the building across the train tracks that could potentially form any number of programs, community gardens, that would connect the river as it continues to develop and eventually to Boyle Heights. Finally, as it relates to bridges, we're in the process of building a new 6th Street bridge. The existing bridge and viaduct, which spans from east to west, for a lot of reasons needed to be taken down. Those stories, everybody has probably heard those stories already. When we began this project, I was interested in trying to go back to that idea of infrastructure needing to do more and not be just about the flow of traffic from east to west, but to also make the bridge a more connective element for different modes of transportation and for different parts of the city, including the flats underneath, the river, the Arts District, and Boyle Heights. It will get cars from left to right or from east to west. There are bicycle pathways, much larger pedestrian pathways. There are a series of ramps and stairs that take bicycles and pedestrians from the river, from the park underneath the east side of the bridge, from the Arts Plaza that'll be on the Arts District side up to the bridge to create a more interwoven, a more interconnected part of the city. This park is an important part of the future life of the city. And here you see the proposed stairs that come up over the arches of the bridge. That connection, and this is the final image I want to talk about, and the role of this bridge is partially pragmatic, but it's also very much about the symbolism that this bridge has in the city. One of the program pieces, one of the requirements of the competition for this bridge was to make a form that was iconic, which is a preposterous thing to try to imagine doing from day one. But out of that, I began to think about other structures in cities that had that postcard iconography and Statue of Liberty, the St. Louis Arch, the Eiffel Tower. And it is true, all of them are incredible things to look at from the distance. But one of the things I realized was that in every case, they were also observatories. They were places to be and to look back out and see the city. And with this bridge, and in many ways with the work that we're trying to do, that idea of observatory, that idea of either a form, a space, or an opportunity to be able to contemplate how the city is continuing to develop is, for me, very much a core idea of architecture. Thank you.
Hello. Hello? That's so bright.
You have sunglasses?
So here's what we're going to do.
We're going to talk in the dark.
Wow. Like that.
You look so elegant backlit. So this was a fascinating presentation, and three incredibly important voices making new architecture and working with progressive concepts. And the question, I want to keep our dialogue together rather short, but I really want to talk to you all about where are things going. And you know, Michael, you mentioned the idea of the West as a kind of starting point. And I think we're all touching on different aspects. You know, Michael, you're dealing with a kind of repetition, modularity. Francois, you're dealing with issues of dematerial, kind of going back to Yves Klein era architecture. Sharon, I mean, you're going crazy. But maybe we can just have a discussion about where is this language going? And you know, Michael, you had mentioned a kind of a view in. We're kind of coming out of a kind of era of sprawl and outward movement, and now we're kind of looking back in. Let's talk about this. I pass it to you because you're hot off the heels of your presentation.
In my mind, that idea of looking in is extremely unfamiliar territory in a place like Los Angeles. Certainly one of the ideas of the West that is fascinating is this idea of a kind of endlessness or a kind of manifest destiny that you can continue to move and expand out further and further and further. And along with that is, especially for people involved in, or cultures involved in creative pursuits, I think there's an implicit optimism. And that's a really important characteristic. That's a really important point. And as we begin to come to the realization that our ability to sprawl, whether for any number of reasons, that becoming more and more difficult, resource management, transportation, convenience, all of those things. As we confront the ending of that, and we start to look in further to ourselves, I think one of the things is, at a very pragmatic level, how do we build for that? But I think even more importantly, it is how do we continue to evolve our own psychology, our own identity, our own sense of ourselves, our own sense of optimism, as we have to change the more traditional forms of that optimism.
And going back to your presentation, Francois, you were talking very much about the idea of the dematerial, whether it's the Klein piece, which was the air architecture, which was never completed, I believe, or your own work, which is dealing with transparency, translucency, indoor, outdoor, mapping that back to Schindler and his first time in Los Angeles, kind of looking at this canvas, which was completely different climate-wise. One of the things that I think of is the idea of the landscape itself here. And we are kind of living in this landscape which it doesn't have a traditional reason for the city. It's not a trade route. There's not a river meeting an ocean. There are not these kind of more formal reasons. And you think about it, you see this kind of vast sprawling landscape. You see a landscape of orange groves, of a relative Mediterranean climate. And you say, what is the export here? And I often ask myself this because I wonder if it's images. And I wonder if it's really about the creation and distribution and projection of images. And that might be the largest export of Los Angeles in some ways. And I look at your architecture and I see how that reflects into it. Do you want to?
Well, I think the idea of the West, it was sort of, as I was reflecting on everyone's presentations, I think the idea of this, Michael used the word simultaneity, but I was thinking about all of us, I think, are thinking about extension and movement, but at the same time, the sort of problematics of that as building architects. So the notion of boundary, the sort of contradiction of movement and the sort of endlessness of that, and the fixity of envelopes in architecture. And I think, for us, if I take that as, I don't know how exactly that's a segue to your question about images, but I think for us that we in the kind of research mode of the way we develop our thinking, we're looking for ways to kind of examine the technical work we do as architects in other mediums. And it's just somehow a way to reflect through a different lens what we're doing. And I think it also captures a lot of the things that are interesting to us, which perhaps connect to our sensibility of architects building in the West, which is ideas about ephemerality. I think we're building buildings, but I think our sensibility towards those spaces is really about flexibility, about generosity, about the sort of qualities of light and atmosphere that I think really define the space we build in, especially in Los Angeles.
Yeah. And Francois, can you talk about that when you came here, when you first came here and kind of decided to stay and make your practice? What was it that drew you to the space? Was it a certain kind of cultural history or landscape, or?
It's a combination. I like that Michael talked about the idea of freedom. For me, it was, I grew up and I studied in Paris, which is supposed to be the most beautiful city in the world. But as an architect, it's a great place to study and to be a young architect. But I was more developing kind of experimental architecture. It's a great place to have ideas and meet people and work with artists and learn about that. But to express yourself in a place like Paris is a little intimidating because you're afraid to mess up, or first there's not many space, and coming in LA for me was a revelation because I love LA, but LA is kind of a mess, and so I was not afraid to mess the place because you can only do better. You look around you. Yeah. And so that's a big point for me. That's like a place where I feel free, where I can express myself, where I can experiment.
So you saw it more as a laboratory.
Yeah. But the other point was because I was interested in the idea of climate as architecture through my study of Yves Klein. LA was created on climate. That's the foundation of Los Angeles. was like drawing people from the rest of the US that were like freezing in the Northeast, and they all came to LA, and LA was sold to the rest of the US as the perfect climate. And for me, it was like the perfect place to be, to develop this idea, and also continuing that tradition that people like Neutra or Schindler, like a century before, came from Europe with their idea and their new concept, and face a new climate and a place where basically you can live without architecture almost in LA. LA is one of the places in the world.
So it's almost a dematerial.
Yeah, like you don't really need architecture in LA. You can almost live outdoor most of the time. So for me, it's it's pretty much the perfect place. I mean, I like to do projects elsewhere, but at this point, it was very a revelation.
Yeah. So I've been looking forward to asking you all the question of where is this going, and I say this very vague question because I would like for you to kind of interpret it. But Michael, I mean, we're yes, I passed this.
Well, maybe you can say, because
but
you're doing something. You're an architect too, like Doug's building a art piece under the ocean. So maybe that's where we're going, under the ocean. That's our future, and you're working on it. You're the next architect for the future.
Well, no, I think you are. No, but we are doing a project under the ocean, which we're in the middle of right now, but more about that later, and I'd love to invite you all. It's free, you just have to penetrate the surface of the Pacific. But Michael, we're in your land down here. I mean, we're by the bridge, you've got a bunch of buildings here, there's a beehive of activity that you've authored, and where do you see that? Do you see a kind of a view inward, as you'd mentioned, or
I like, Francois talked about, he mentioned also coming here because, in a sense, you could do anything. And while specifically, I was talking about mostly Los Angeles, and especially this more or less the downtown area with a number of the projects. In a way, all of those projects are trying to look at the idea of what a contemporary city, how architecture can respond to a lot of the challenges of a contemporary city. I think while images are an incredible export of Los Angeles, I think one of the great export economies in Los Angeles is our urbanism, for better or worse. And if you look at so many different contemporary cities around the world, they are, again, for better or worse, taking on many of the same characteristics of a place like Los Angeles. So for me, where we're going, there are many different voices up here. So I think what it says at some level is that there's a lot of diversity of opinion about where you might be able to go or you might be going. But one thing I do know is that the very real problems, the very real challenges in front of us are not only ours to deal with, and that the way that we begin to approach these things, the kind of invention we bring to projects is likely going to have a significant influence on not just Los Angeles, but urbanism as a whole. And that I think is an exciting moment.
Sharon?
Yeah, I was just reflecting. I think it's great to see the portfolio of work Michael presented, because I think it does suggest, I mean, if we think about the changing of Los Angeles in the last maybe 5-10 years, it's been less at the scale of maybe where a planner might operate, and it's really through the sort of introduction of new buildings, new significant works of architecture. And I think, especially in a city like LA, that because of the fact that density is finally becoming a condition we have to address, that I think it's a really exciting moment probably largely in American cities to imagine the role of architecture to reshape cities. I mean, the idea that we can, by integrating single works of architecture into the systems of infrastructure, roads, trains, all the things that connect us, I think that's a really powerful moment for us to have our culture believe in the power of architecture to have an impact at a much larger scale.
Does architecture have to be built? Does it have to have form?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that, I feel that needs to operate at many different levels to, I think, have impact culturally. I mean, I think built architecture will maybe have the most impact on, let's say, a city, but I feel what was exciting, I think, about the range of ideas that we talked about tonight is that they're all, I think, architecture can engage ideas at all those levels and have a significant impact on the discourse about within the realm of our practice, but engaging artists, engaging other thinkers. And I think that's also a direction that we're all going to need to go. We have to talk to so many other people outside of what our practice, the domain of our practice.
So perhaps where architecture can go is a much more elastic definition of architecture.
Right.
Something which is dematerial, which is sound, which is light, which is generative, things which can continuously mutate and live and exchange around us.
One of the things that Sharon, I think, made a very compelling point about was the power of practice, and or a practice, whether it's an artistic practice, architectural practice. The idea that the thing that you are doing has real significance, has real power. That's, I think, that strikes me as a very important idea, very important moment, that within that range of work, you called it elastic, but within a range of work, whether it's drawings or building or ideas about technology, about more conceptual proposals, that architecture has the capacity as a discipline to reach into many different areas and make something that takes an idea and gives it form. And that's a powerful way to communicate ideas. And in that sense, I think that's what architecture is. Even if it's a building, it represents something. It represents ideas. And that in any of our individual practices, that is pretty much the goal. That sometimes the buildings are the currency of explaining what it is that you're thinking about the world. Sometimes it's a collage, a drawing. Sometimes it's an exhibition design. But that within that practice is what's very important.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's been an amazing evening. Thank you.